The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched before Elena Vasquez like a vast cathedral of judgment. 12 different alien species sat in their designated sections, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Today they looked like judges preparing to deliver a death sentence. Elena stood alone at the human podium, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. At 62 years old, she had served as humanity's chief ambassador for 15 years. She had seen good times and bad times, but nothing quite like this. The vote had been unanimous. 12 species, 12 votes against humanity, 0 in favor. Speaker HFY of the Andromedans rose from the central platform. Their tall, thin body moved with the grace that their species was famous for. When they spoke, their voice carried the musical quality that made Andromedan poetry so beloved across the galaxy. The decision is final, HFY announced. After careful consideration of the evidence presented over the past 6 months, the Galactic Council has voted to expel humanity from membership. This decision takes effect immediately. Elena felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of the millions of humans scattered across dozens of worlds, building lives among the stars. All of that was about to end. Counselor Vextar of the Zephyrian stood next. Their crystal body caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. The charges against humanity are clear and numerous. Unauthorized first contact with primitive species, refusal to follow quarantine protocols, military intervention without council approval. The list goes on. Elena remembered each incident they mentioned. The primitive species had been facing extinction from a plague. The quarantine protocols would have let an entire world die from a treatable disease. The military intervention had stopped a genocide, but the council saw only rule-breaking. The Kepler incident alone, Vextar continued, shows humanity's complete disregard for proper diplomatic procedures. When the council ordered non-interference in the Civil War, humans chose to ignore our wisdom. They sent peacekeeping forces anyway. Elena had been there during the Kepler crisis. She had watched the reports come in about mass killings, about children being used as weapons, about entire cities being wiped out. The council had debated for weeks while people died. Captain Morrison had made his choice in minutes and saved 2 million lives. But the council remembered it differently. Councillor Hrenth of the Vorthans spoke next. Their massive bear-like form made their voice sound like distant thunder. Humans are too unpredictable, too willing to break rules when they feel it serves their idea of justice. They cannot be trusted to follow the careful balance we have built. The careful balance. Elena almost smiled at that phrase. The balance that let species die rather than risk change. The balance that valued procedure over life. The balance that had kept the galaxy peaceful by keeping it static. Other counselors added their voices. The Centaurians spoke about human recklessness. The hegemony listed human violations of trade law. The Nexus Collective complained about human interference with their communication networks. Each species had their own list of grievances. Elena listened to it all without moving. She had expected this day for years. The signs had been clear. Humanity had always been different from the other council species. Where they saw problems to be managed, humans saw problems to be solved. Where they saw acceptable losses, humans saw people who could be saved. The galaxy had grown comfortable with humans doing the jobs that others found too dangerous or too messy, exploring dangerous regions, dealing with criminals and pirates, handling first contact with aggressive species, making the hard choices that let other species keep their hands clean. But comfort had turned to suspicion. Suspicion had become resentment, and resentment had finally become this vote. The terms are simple, HFY said, reading from their datapad. All human colonies beyond the Sol system must be evacuated within 1 standard year. All human-operated stations will be transferred to other species. All trade agreements are void. All research partnerships are ended. All military cooperation agreements are canceled. Elena did some quick math in her head. 3 million humans lived outside the Sol system. Moving them all in 1 year would be possible, but difficult. Many had been born on other worlds and had never seen Earth. They would be leaving behind homes, businesses, friends. Furthermore, HFY continued, all human-discovered trade routes will be redistributed among council members. All human research will be reviewed and, where necessary, confiscated for the greater good of galactic civilization. That hurt more than Elena showed. Human explorers had mapped most of the galaxy's safe hyperspace routes. Human scientists had made breakthrough discoveries in medicine, physics, and engineering. Now all of that would belong to others. Do you have anything to say in response, Ambassador Vasquez? HFY asked. Any final words for the council? Elena looked around the chamber. She saw faces that had once been friendly or at least respectful. Councillor Yeath of the Hegemony, who had worked with her on the Tau Ceti trade agreements. Councillor Zem of the Collective, who had praised human communication technology just last year. Councillor Fex of the Centaurians, who had invited her to their homeworld for their Harmony Festival. All of them looked away when her eyes met theirs. Elena could have given the speech she had prepared. She could have talked about everything humans had done for the galaxy, the pirates they had fought, the plagues they had stopped, the wars they had prevented, the impossible problems they had solved when no one else would even try. She could have mentioned the early warning systems that humans maintained in the dangerous sectors, the rescue services that humans provided in regions too hazardous for other species, the peace treaties that human diplomats had negotiated between species that had been fighting for centuries. She could have asked what would happen when the next crisis came, and there were no humans around to handle it. Instead, Elena simply nodded. She picked up her datapad and walked toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden silence of the chamber. Ambassador, Councillor Hrenth called out. Surely you have something to say. Elena stopped at the door and turned back. For a moment, she looked at each councillor in turn. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber. Good luck. The words hung in the air as the door sealed behind her. In the chamber, the councillors looked at each other with confusion. They had expected anger, threats, desperate pleas for reconsideration. They had prepared responses for human emotional outbursts and dramatic speeches. They had not prepared for two simple words and a quiet exit. Slowly, the confusion turned to relief, then to satisfaction. HFY called for a recess, and the councillors began talking among themselves. The conversations were lighter now, more relaxed. The dangerous humans were gone. The galaxy could return to its proper order. Vextar's crystalline voice rang with pleasure as they spoke to their aide. Finally, we can govern without worrying about human interference. No more emergency sessions about human violations. No more explaining why we cannot simply ignore proper procedures. Hrenth laughed, a sound like rolling stones. The galaxy will be much more peaceful without their constant meddling. Other species follow rules. Humans made their own rules and expected us to accept them. As the day wore on, word spread throughout the council building. Staff members who had worked with humans for years felt mixed emotions, but the overall mood was celebratory. Many species had genuine grievances against human actions, even if those actions had saved lives. By evening, the celebration had spread to the council worlds. News broadcasts spoke of a new era of galactic harmony. Editorial writers praised the wisdom of the council's decision. Citizens who had never met a human felt safer knowing they were gone. Elena Vasquez sat in her small ship, already preparing for the journey back to Earth. She had sent the news ahead through quantum transmission. Within hours, evacuation orders would go out to every human world and station beyond Sol. She thought about the celebration happening behind her and shook her head. The council was throwing a party because they had just removed the galaxy's immune system, but they would figure that out eventually. 3 months after the vote, Captain Sarah Chen walked through the empty corridors of Proxima Research Station for the last time. Her footsteps echoed in the silence where once hundreds of scientists from a dozen different species had worked together. Now only the non-human staff remained, and they moved through their work with visible confusion. For 20 years, this station had been the galaxy's leading center for quantum physics research. The humans had been more than half the staff, including most of the senior researchers. Sarah stopped at Laboratory 7, where she had spent the best years of her career. Inside, Dr. Kethamore of the Centaurians was trying to operate equipment that human engineers had designed. His forearms moved with their usual grace, but his large eyes showed frustration. The quantum resonance chamber is not responding correctly, he said when he saw Sarah. The harmonic frequencies keep shifting out of alignment. Sarah looked at the readings on the displays. You need to adjust the temporal sync every 4 hours. The quantum field drift is natural in this region of space. We usually compensate automatically, but the manual does not mention this procedure, Kethamore said. It's not in the manual because it's different for every location. We just learned to feel when it needed adjustment. Sarah made a few quick changes to the settings and the equipment hummed back to life. Kethamore watched her work with something like sadness in his large eyes. How will we continue the research without this knowledge? Sarah packed the last of her personal items into a carrying case. I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're brilliant scientists, but Sarah, your team was working on the unified field theory. Dr. Martinez was close to a breakthrough with the dark matter equations. Dr. Okafor's work on quantum tunneling could revolutionize space travel. How can we continue without them? I'm sorry, Keth, the Council made their decision. We have to respect that. Kethmore's species communicated emotion through changes in skin color. Right now, his skin showed deep purple patterns that Sarah had learned meant distress. This is wrong. Your research could benefit every species in the galaxy. Sarah paused at the door. Maybe someone else will figure it out. Good luck, my friend. The same scene was playing out across the galaxy. On industrial worlds, human engineers packed up their tools and left behind factories they had designed. On agricultural planets, human botanists gave hurried explanations about growing cycles and soil management before boarding evacuation ships. Admiral Jackson stood on the bridge of the battleship Freedom, watching his fleet prepare for departure from the Kepler system. 37 ships, the entire Fourth Fleet getting ready to leave the sector they had protected for 15 years. His communications officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, looked up from her station. Sir, we're getting distress calls from the Outer Rim. Pirate activity is increasing in the Vega sector. Forward the calls to the Zephyrian patrol ships, Jackson replied. They're taking over security for this region. Sir, the Zephyrian ships don't patrol the asteroid fields. They say it's too dangerous for their crystal hulls. Jackson nodded grimly. The asteroid fields had been pirate havens for centuries until human ships started regular patrols. Human vessels were built tough, designed to take hits and keep fighting. Zephyrian ships were elegant and fast, but they shattered if they hit a rock. Not our problem anymore, Lieutenant. The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. What about the mining colonies in the asteroid fields? Who will protect them? They'll have to figure something out. On the prison world of Tartarus, Warden Torres walked through the maximum security blocks one final time. The prisoners here were the galaxy's worst criminals, beings too dangerous to be held anywhere else. The facility was built inside an asteroid field near a forming star, making escape impossible. It also made the job incredibly dangerous. Solar flares, gravity fluctuations, and radiation storms were constant threats. Only humans had been willing to staff the facility, and only human pilots could navigate the treacherous space around it to bring supplies. Torres stopped at the central control room, where his replacement waited. Except there was no replacement. The Council had sent an automated system to take over prison operations. Computer report status, Torres said. All systems operational. Life support functioning normally. Estimated time until next supply delivery, 4 months, 18 days. And who's bringing the next supply delivery? No delivery ship assigned. Please contact Council Administration for scheduling. Torres shook his head. The Council had solved the human problem, but forgotten to solve the problems that humans had been handling. He activated his personal recording device. Final log, Warden Torres. Leaving automated systems in charge of Tartarus facility. Life support good for approximately 2 years. Recommend finding replacement staff soon. These prisoners are locked up for good reasons. On the edge of Council space, Professor Williams shut down the deep space monitoring station that had been her life's work for 12 years. The station tracked threats from outside the galaxy, everything from rogue asteroids to signs of hostile alien activity. It was lonely work. The station was too far from any populated system for most species to volunteer. Humans had run it because humans seemed to enjoy being on the frontier, even when the frontier was empty space between galaxies. Williams recorded her final report. Outer Rim Monitor Station Omega going offline. All current threat assessments attached to this transmission. Recommend maintaining watch on grid sections 7 through 12. Automated probes in those areas have been sending unusual signals for the past 6 months. She paused, looking at the data on her screens. Strange energy readings. Almost like radio signals, but with patterns that didn't match any known technology. They might be nothing. They might be equipment malfunction. Or they might be something that required investigation. Under normal circumstances, she would have recommended sending a survey team. But survey teams into unknown space were usually human crews, and there were no human crews anymore. Recommend investigation when convenient, she added to her report, then powered down the station. Across the galaxy, trade routes that humans had pioneered were shutting down. The Epsilon Corridor, which human traders had opened by figuring out how to navigate through a field of black hole fragments. The Nebula Run, where human ships could thread between gravity wells that crushed vessels with less robust engines. The Deep Circuit, a hyperspace route through a region where other species' navigation systems failed. Captain Morrison of the merchant vessel Prosperity looked at his route charts one last time. His family had been trading these routes for 3 generations. They knew every dangerous passage, every safe harbor, every shortcut that could save weeks of travel time. The Vorthans are taking over the Epsilon Corridor, his first officer reported. Morrison laughed bitterly. Good luck to them. Their ships are too heavy to make the micro jumps through the fragment field. They'll lose a dozen vessels before they give up. What about the cargo contracts? Cancelled. All of them. 23 years of business relationships gone in a day. The Morrison family had discovered the Epsilon Corridor in the first place. They had spent months mapping safe passages through the black hole fragments, losing 3 ships and nearly dying a dozen times. Other species had called them crazy for trying. Now those same species would claim the route as their own, if they could figure out how to use it. Dr. Yania of the Hegemony stood in her laboratory on the medical world of Sanctuary, surrounded by equipment she didn't fully understand. The humans had left detailed manuals, but there were gaps. Procedures that had become so routine that no one bothered to document them. She was looking at a patient with Xerian fever, a disease that had been killing people for centuries until human doctors developed a treatment. The treatment worked, but it required precise timing and dosages that the manuals didn't explain clearly. Computer, show me all recorded procedures for Xerian fever treatment. The display showed hundreds of cases, all successful, but watching the recordings, Yania noticed small variations in each treatment. The human doctors adjusted their approach based on factors that weren't mentioned in the official protocols. She tried calling Dr. Martinez, the human doctor who had developed the treatment. But Dr. Martinez was already on a transport ship heading for Earth. Yania looked at her patient, then at the records, then back at her patient. She would have to guess. And if she guessed wrong, her patient would die. The pattern repeated itself everywhere humans had worked. Critical knowledge that existed only in human minds was leaving the galaxy. Systems that worked because of human intuition and experience were beginning to fail. On the council worlds, there were still celebrations. The humans were leaving peacefully, proving that the council's decision had been correct. Order was being restored. But in the quiet spaces between the celebrations, other voices were beginning to speak. Voices asking practical questions about who would handle the jobs that humans had been doing. Voices wondering if maybe the humans had been more important than anyone realized. These voices were still quiet, but they were growing louder each day. 6 months after humanity's departure, Council Engineer Vorthak stared at the main display in the Nexus Gate Control Center with growing alarm. Red warning lights flashed across the massive holographic map of the galaxy, each one representing a communication relay that had gone offline. The Nexus Gate network was the backbone of galactic civilization. Faster-than-light communication between star systems depended on quantum entanglement devices that required constant fine-tuning. For over a century, human engineers had maintained the delicate balance needed to keep signals flowing across thousands of light-years. Another cascade failure in Sector 7, reported his assistant, a young Andromedan named Thais. That's 12 relays in the past week. Vorthak's tentacles writhed with stress. His species, the Nautiloids, were master engineers, but even they couldn't understand the subtle adjustments that kept the quantum matrices stable. The human engineers had developed an intuitive feel for the work that couldn't be taught from manuals. What about the backup protocols? Vorthak asked. The humans left detailed instructions, but they don't cover every situation. The quantum fields keep shifting in ways that the manuals don't predict. On his personal communicator, Vorthak tried calling Chief Engineer Kowalski, who had run the Nexus Gate network for 15 years. The call failed. Kowalski was somewhere in human space now, beyond the reach of the failing communication grid. Across the galaxy, other crises were emerging. Dr. Selinra of the Andromedan Medical Authority stood in the emergency ward of Central Hospital on Andromeda Prime, watching helplessly as patients died from a disease that should have been easily treatable. Kavari plague had been eradicated from Andromedan worlds for centuries, but only because of a special antigen treatment. The antigen was manufactured exclusively on New Geneva, a human agricultural world that specialized in biological compounds. The humans had left behind enough antigen for 2 months before evacuating. Now the supply was gone and no one knew how to make more. The production records are incomplete, reported Dr. Tyson, her chief researcher. The humans mentioned something called seasonal adjustments and soil microbiome balancing, but there are no specific procedures. Dr. Salinra looked at the rows of patients in isolation wards. How long before we lose containment? The plague spread slowly, but it's already reached 3 more systems. Without the antigen, we're looking at millions of deaths within a year. The Andromedan government had already sent urgent messages to other medical centers, asking if anyone knew how to synthesize the compound. So far, no one had answered. In the Cygnus sector, Director Thane of the Vorthon Trade Consortium watched his shipping empire crumble. The Vorthons had eagerly claimed the lucrative trade routes that human merchants had pioneered, but they were discovering that claiming a route and using it were very different things. We've lost another convoy in the Spiral Nebula, his operations manager reported. That's 6 ships this month. Thane's massive form shifted uneasily in his chair. What happened this time? Navigation failure. The hyperspace beacons are working, but our pilots keep getting lost in the gravitational distortions. The human traders use some kind of intuitive navigation that isn't in any of our star charts. The Spiral Nebula route was the fastest way to transport goods between the inner and outer rim worlds. Human ships had been running it safely for decades, making it look easy. But they had been reading subtle changes in the space-time geometry that Vorthon instruments couldn't detect. What about hiring local pilots who know the route? There are no local pilots. The humans were the only ones crazy enough to live in nebula space. Thane looked at the shipping schedules that showed months of delays. His consortium had borrowed heavily to take over the human trade routes, expecting huge profits. Instead, they were facing bankruptcy. On the prison world of Tartarus, automated systems were beginning to fail. Warden Torres had been gone for 4 months and no one had come to replace him. The facility's life support was still working, but other problems were mounting. The prison housed 50,000 of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. Warlords, terrorists, pirates, and worse. The automated systems could keep them locked up, but they couldn't handle the complex social dynamics of a massive prison population. Riots were starting in several cell blocks. The automated defenses could contain them for now, but the system wasn't designed to run a prison without experienced staff. More importantly, supplies were running low. The facility needed regular deliveries of food, medicine, and replacement parts. But the supply route to Tartarus required navigation through an asteroid field that was constantly shifting due to the nearby forming star. Human pilots had made the run every month for 15 years, dodging solar flares and gravitational anomalies. Now the supply ships sat at the edge of the system, their non-human crews unable to plot a safe course through the chaos. The prison's computer sent automated requests for assistance, but the responses were always the same. Supply mission too hazardous for available crews. Please arrange alternative. In the Deep Space Monitoring Station on the galactic rim, automated probes continued their lonely watch. Professor Williams had programmed them well before departing, but they were limited by their programming. The strange signals from beyond the galaxy were getting stronger and more numerous. The probes dutifully recorded the data, but they couldn't analyze patterns or make the intuitive leaps that human scientists were famous for. The signals showed organized patterns, almost like language. They were also moving, getting closer to the galaxy's edge at a steady rate. If anyone had been watching, they might have recognized the signs of a massive fleet approaching from intergalactic space. But no one was watching. On Kepler 7th, the world where humans had supposedly interfered in a civil war, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Zephyrian mediation team that had replaced the human peacekeepers lasted exactly 3 weeks before evacuating. The tribal leaders won't listen to reason, reported Ambassador Crystalleth to the council. They insist on settling their differences through combat rather than negotiation. The human peacekeepers had spent 5 years learning the complex cultural dynamics of Kepler 7. They had understood which tribal leaders could be trusted, which factions were open to compromise, and which conflicts went back generations. More importantly, they had earned respect through their willingness to fight alongside any group that was being oppressed. The Zephyrians had tried to mediate from a position of aloof neutrality, which the Keplerian tribes saw as weakness. Within days of the human departure, Old alliances had collapsed and new wars had begun. Council Speaker HFY read the reports from Kepler-7 with growing concern. How many casualties? Initial estimates suggest 200,000 dead in the first month of fighting. The number is rising rapidly. What about sending Centaurian peacekeepers? The Centaurians refuse to intervene in what they call a barbaric conflict. They don't want to risk their personnel in ground combat. HFY set down the report and rubbed their temples. The Keplerian situation had been stable for years under human oversight. Now it was becoming a humanitarian disaster that threatened to destabilize the entire sector. Dr. Kethmore stood in his empty laboratory on Proxima Station, surrounded by equipment he still couldn't operate properly. Half of his research staff had requested transfers to other projects. The quantum physics program that had been the galaxy's most advanced was now barely functional. He activated his personal communicator and tried one more. Time to reach Dr. Sarah Chen. Maybe she would be willing to consult remotely, even though humans were no longer officially part of galactic civilization. The communication failed. The Nexus Gate relay for this sector had gone offline 2 days ago. Kethmore looked at the breakthrough research that was sitting unfinished in the station's computers. Dr. Martinez's work on dark matter had been weeks away from completion. Dr. Okafor's quantum tunneling project could have revolutionized space travel. Now it would probably never be finished. He thought about the celebration that had followed humanity's departure, the relief that the troublesome humans were gone, the confidence that galactic civilization would run more smoothly without their interference. No one had asked what would happen when the problems that humans solved started appearing again. No one had thought about who would maintain the systems that humans had built. No one had considered that maybe humans had been doing important work, even if it wasn't always done in the approved manner. Across the galaxy, similar realizations were beginning to dawn. The humans hadn't just been rule breakers and troublemakers. They had been the people who handled jobs that no one else wanted to do. They had been the ones who went into dangerous places and solved impossible problems. Now those problems were coming back, and there was no one left to solve them. The celebration was over. The real consequences were just beginning. 1 year after humanity's expulsion, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The great hall that had once echoed with celebration now felt heavy with dread. Empty seats marked where prosperous worlds had once sent representatives, worlds now cut off by communication failures and collapsed trade routes. Council Speaker HFY stood at the central podium, their usually melodious voice strained with exhaustion. "The situation reports make for difficult reading," they announced. "We face challenges across every sector of Council space. The challenges had grown beyond anyone's worst predictions. The Nexus Gate network was failing faster than engineers could repair it. Entire sectors had gone dark. Their quantum communication relays burned out from cascading overloads. Engineer Vorthax teams worked around the clock, but they were fighting a losing battle against technology they didn't fully understand. "We've lost contact with 47 star systems in the past month," reported Councillor Yex of the Hegemony. "Trade disruption is causing food shortages on 12 worlds. Industrial production has dropped by 60% across the Inner Rim. The medical crisis was even worse. The Kavari plague had spread to 8 Andromedan systems, killing hundreds of thousands. Without the special antigen that only humans knew how to produce, the disease was unstoppable. Other medical emergencies were emerging as human-developed treatments ran out of supply." Dr. Salinra appeared on the emergency communication channel from Andromeda Prime, her image flickering with static from the failing relay network. "We need immediate assistance with biological manufacturing. The plague is spreading faster than our quarantine protocols can contain." "What about synthetic alternatives?" asked Councillor Hrenth of the Vorthans. "We've tried 17 different synthesis methods. None of them work. The human process involves some kind of biological cultivation that we can't replicate." Councillor Vexitar of the Zephyrians spoke up, their crystal voice sharp with frustration. "Perhaps we should consider reaching out to the humans for technical assistance." The hall fell silent. For a moment, nobody wanted to voice what they were all thinking. HFY cleared their throat. "The Council voted unanimously to expel humanity. We cannot simply reverse that decision because we face temporary difficulties." "Temporary?" Vextar's crystal form flashed red with anger. 47 systems are isolated. The plague has killed more people in the past month than died in the last century of border conflicts. Our trade network is collapsing. How is this temporary? The arguments that followed were heated but pointless. Even if the Council swallowed their pride and asked for human help, they had no way to contact Earth. The Sol system lay beyond the reach of the failing Nexus Gate network. Worse news kept arriving. The prison world of Tartarus had gone completely silent 3 weeks ago. Long-range sensors showed that the facility was still intact, but no communications were getting through. 50,000 dangerous criminals were locked in a fortress that no one could reach or monitor. The last automated message mentioned food riots, reported Security Chief Vison. Life support was failing in 3 sectors. We have to assume the worst. The asteroid mining colonies that had depended on human protection were under constant attack from pirates. The Zephyrian patrol ships assigned to replace human forces had retreated after losing 6 vessels in the first month. The pirates now controlled the entire outer rim. Captain Zeltar of the Zephyrian Navy delivered his report with obvious embarrassment. Our ships are not designed for combat in asteroid fields. The pirates use hit-and-run tactics that exploit the gravitational interference. Human ships could handle those conditions, but ours cannot. What about the mining colonies? Asked HFY. We've evacuated what populations we could. The rest are on their own. The evacuation of the mining colonies triggered a refugee crisis that overwhelmed Council relief services. 3 million people had fled from the Outer Rim, seeking safety on already overcrowded core worlds. Food production couldn't keep up with demand, especially with trade routes disrupted. On the frontier worlds, stranger problems were emerging. Deep space monitoring stations had detected massive energy signatures approaching from outside the galaxy. The automated probes left behind by human scientists were sending increasingly urgent warnings. But there was no one left who understood the data. Professor Thelvek of the Centaurian Science Authority had spent weeks trying to decode the probe data. The signals show artificial patterns, she reported. Organized formations moving at significant fractions of light speed. Whatever this is, it's big and it's intelligent. How far away? Asked HFY. Approximately 18 months at current velocity. The objects will reach the galactic rim within 2 years. The council chamber erupted in worried murmurs. First contact with unknown alien species was supposed to follow careful protocols. There were procedures for initial communication, cultural assessment, and gradual integration. But those procedures assumed that contact would be made by human exploration teams, who had handled every first contact situation for the past century. We need to prepare a first contact team, said Counselor Fex of the Centaurians. Who? Asked Vextar bluntly. Which of our species has experience with hostile first contact? Which of our diplomats knows how to handle aggressive aliens? The answer was none of them. Human diplomats had specialized in difficult first contact situations because they were the only species willing to take the risks involved. Other council species had always left that dangerous work to the humans. The bad news kept coming. The Kepler-7 situation had escalated into a full-scale planetary war. The death toll had reached 500,000 and showed no signs of slowing. Refugee ships were fleeing the system, carrying reports of atrocities that made council members physically ill. The Keplerian tribes are using chemical weapons, reported Ambassador Crystaleth via emergency transmission. They've abandoned all pretense of civilized warfare. The planet is becoming uninhabitable. Counselor Hrenth slammed his massive fist on his desk. This is intolerable. We must intervene! With what forces? Vextar asked. Our military units are designed for patrol duties, not ground combat. The humans were our peacekeeping specialists. The Council had built a military designed to maintain order in a peaceful galaxy. Their ships were fast and elegant, perfect for showing the flag and conducting rescue operations. But they weren't built for real fighting against determined enemies. Human military forces had been the Council's hidden strength. Human ships were tough and heavily armed. Human soldiers were trained for combat in hostile environments. Human commanders understood that sometimes peace could only be maintained through the credible threat of overwhelming force. Now that strength was gone, and the galaxy was discovering how much it had depended on human protection, Dr. Kethmore submitted his resignation from Proxima Station via one of the last functioning communication relays. The research program is no longer viable, he wrote. Without human expertise, we cannot maintain the equipment or continue the experiments. I recommend shutting down the facility. Similar reports were coming in from research stations across the galaxy. Projects that had promised revolutionary breakthroughs were being abandoned. Medical research that could have saved millions of lives was grinding to a halt. Scientific progress that had advanced steadily for centuries was reversing. The final blow came from the economic reports. The Vorthan Trade Consortium, once the galaxy's largest shipping company, had declared bankruptcy. The routes they had claimed from human traders proved impossible to operate safely. Ships were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Galactic commerce is down 70%, reported economic advisor Melthak. Industrial worlds can't get raw materials. Agricultural worlds can't ship food. The entire economic system is collapsing. As the emergency session continued into its third day, a pattern became clear. Humanity hadn't just been one species among 12 in the Council. They had been the critical species that held everything else together. They had done the dangerous jobs, solved the impossible problems, and maintained the systems that everyone else took for granted. Now those systems were failing, and there was no one left who knew how to fix them. Counselor Yek stood up slowly, his ancient form showing the strain of the past year. I think we need to face the truth. And we made a mistake. The humans weren't the problem. They were the solution to problems we didn't even know we had. It's too late for regrets, Vexhai replied. The humans are gone. We must find new solutions, and with what? Vextar asked bitterly. Our elegant ships that shatter in asteroid fields? Our cautious diplomats who won't take risks? Our careful procedures that let people die while we debate? Vexhai had no answer. Outside the council chamber, the galaxy was learning the true cost of their decision. They had thrown out the species that protected them, maintained their systems, and solved their problems. They had celebrated getting rid of the troublesome humans without understanding what trouble really looked like. Now they were about to find out. 2 years after humanity's departure, archivist Zil-F made a discovery that would haunt the galaxy forever. Deep in the Council's oldest archives, buried beneath centuries of bureaucratic records, lay documents that the current leadership had never seen. Zil-F was a young Andromedan, barely 50 years old, working to catalog historical files for digital preservation. The work was boring but necessary as the failing Nexus Gate network made data backup increasingly critical. Most of the files were routine meeting minutes and trade agreements from the early days of the Council. Then Zil-F found the predecessor archives. The files were ancient, dating back over 3,000 years to the very founding of the Galactic Council. But they weren't about the current Council at all. They were about previous galactic civilizations, 17 different eras of spacefaring unity that had risen and fallen before the current species ever reached the stars. Zil-F's skin patterns shifted to deep blue as they read, a sign of profound shock. Each previous civilization had followed the same pattern. Different species, different technologies, but always the same cycle. A galaxy-spanning civilization would arise, bringing together multiple species in trade and cooperation. For centuries or even millennia they would prosper. Art and science would flourish. Peace would reign among the stars. Then the problems would begin. Systems would start failing. Trade routes would become too dangerous to travel. Crises would emerge that required immediate action rather than careful deliberation. And always there was one species that stepped forward to handle the dangerous jobs. These species shared remarkable characteristics across all 17 civilizations. They were curious to the point of recklessness. They adapted quickly to new situations. They were willing to take enormous personal risks to help others. Most importantly, they asked uncomfortable questions and refused to accept that problems were unsolvable. They were explorers, engineers, peacekeepers, and problem solvers. They went to dangerous places and did necessary jobs that other species found too risky or too dirty. They held galactic civilization together through their willingness to sacrifice safety for progress, and in every single case, the other species eventually expelled them. The pattern was always the same. The helper species would be seen as too aggressive, too unpredictable, too willing to break rules for what they saw as the greater good. The other species would grow tired of their interference and vote them out of galactic society. Each time there was celebration. Each time the remaining species believed they could build a better, more peaceful civilization without the troublemakers. Each time, they were wrong. Zil-F read account after account of galactic civilizations collapsing within decades of expelling their helper species. Trade networks failed, scientific progress stopped, military threats went unaddressed, complex systems broke down without the people who understood how to maintain them. The 17th such civilization had fallen only 4,000 years ago. Their helper species had been called the Vanguard, and the records described them in terms that sounded eerily familiar. Aggressive explorers who refuse to follow proper safety protocols. Dangerous militants who intervene in conflicts without authorization. Reckless scientists who experiment with technologies beyond their understanding. The same accusations that had been leveled against humanity. Sci-Fi found the final message sent by the Vanguard as they departed. Galactic space forever. To those who come after us, we have been cast out 17 times across galactic history. Each time we hoped the cycle would break. Each time we were wrong. The pattern is older than any of our species, and it will repeat again. When the darkness comes from beyond the galaxy, remember that we offered to stand watch. Remember that you chose order over protection. Below that message was a star chart showing massive objects in the void between galaxies. Objects that moved with purpose and intelligence. Objects that were approaching the galaxy on a predictable schedule. They had arrived every 4,000 to 5,000 years throughout galactic history. They had destroyed 17 different civilizations, always striking just decades after the helper species had been expelled. The pattern was not coincidental. The timing was deliberate. Sci-Fi's hands shook as they cross-referenced the historical data with current sensor readings. The objects detected by human monitoring stations were following the same trajectory as the ones that had destroyed the Vanguard civilization. They were due to arrive in approximately 10 months. Sci-Fi rushed to share their discovery with the Council leadership, but communication with the Central Worlds had been cut off for weeks. The Nexus gate failures had finally isolated the archive world where they worked. Instead, Sci-Fi recorded their findings and transmitted them via the last functioning long-range beacon, hoping someone would receive the message in time. On Earth, Ambassador Elena Vasquez received Sci-Fi's transmission 3 days later. She sat in her small office in Geneva, reading the historical records with growing horror and recognition. Humanity was the 18th helper species, following a pattern that stretched back millions of years. Elena had spent the past 2 years helping to coordinate the evacuation of human colonies. 3 million people had been successfully relocated to Earth and the other Sol system worlds. It had been a massive undertaking, but humanity had managed it with typical efficiency. The humans who returned brought stories from across the galaxy. Engineers talked about systems they had built now failing without maintenance. Doctors described medical treatments that no one else could replicate. Traders mentioned routes that other species couldn't navigate safely, but there were also stranger reports. Deep space monitoring crews described sensor readings that didn't match any known technology. Military personnel mentioned automated distress signals from the edges of known space. Scientists brought data about energy signatures that suggested massive artificial objects beyond the galactic rim. Elena had dismissed these reports as side effects of the general chaos following humanity's departure. Now she understood that they were something much worse. She activated the emergency communication system that connected Earth to all human colonies in the Sol system. Within hours, she was speaking to the Human Colonial Council, a body that had been formed to govern humanity's affairs after their expulsion from galactic society. The historical data is clear, Elena told the assembled representatives. These objects have destroyed every galactic civilization for millions of years. They wait until each civilization expels its helper species, then attack when the galaxy is most vulnerable. Dr. Sarah Chen, now serving as Earth's chief science officer, studied the sensor data. The energy signatures match what we detected from the deep space monitoring stations. These aren't random aliens. They're specifically designed to destroy galactic civilizations. Admiral Jackson, who had been named defense coordinator for the Sol system, looked at the tactical projections. When do they arrive? Based on the historical pattern and current sensor data, approximately 10 months. The Human Colonial Council fell silent. Outside the conference room, Earth continued its daily routine, unaware that an ancient enemy was approaching with the power to destroy entire civilizations. "Do we warn the Council?" asked Dr. Martinez, who now served as Earth's medical authority. Elena looked at the communication equipment that could, in theory, still reach some Council worlds. Warn them about what? That they're about to be invaded by an enemy they can't fight? That they need the help of the species they expelled? They could prepare defenses. Admiral Jackson shook his head. With what military? The Council's forces are designed for patrols and ceremonies, not real warfare. Their elegant ships will shatter against serious opposition. What about evacuation? To where? These objects are approaching from intergalactic space. There's nowhere in the galaxy to hide. Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city of Geneva, where humans from dozens of worlds now lived side by side, refugees from a galactic civilization that had rejected them, now facing an enemy that had destroyed 17 previous civilizations. The pattern has repeated 18 times, she said quietly. Each helper species tried to protect the galaxy that expelled them. Each time they failed. Each time everyone died, so what do we do? Dr. Chen asked. Elena turned back to the council. We break the pattern. Over the following weeks, humanity began the most ambitious project in their history. Not evacuation, not defense, but something unprecedented in galactic records. They began building a fleet designed specifically to fight an enemy that had never been defeated. Human shipyards, which had been retooling for civilian production, switched to military construction. Engineers who had maintained the galaxy's infrastructure now designed weapons systems. Scientists who had solved impossible problems for other species now focused on solving the ultimate problem. The approaching objects were massive, larger than anything in the galactic fleet. They used technologies that had defeated 17 different civilizations over millions of years. They had never lost a war, but they had never fought humans before. In the deep archives on Earth, human historians found references to the 18th pattern. Ancient predictions that spoke of a helper species that would not flee when expelled. A species that would stand and fight not for gratitude or glory,